Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we convene a 5-day program on forgiveness in a time of duress. Last week, we convened a 5-day program on strategies of resistance in a time of Trump. And we wanted to follow it with something that goes to the deepest level of our humanity. And that is to contemplate the question of the meaning of forgiveness in the face of great criminality. Are there acts that are unforgivable? What is the scope of forgiveness? How do we even begin to approach it? I want to honor this day, which is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945, by Russian troops who came upon Auschwitz, and many of the photographs that we've all seen come from that liberation moment. And over the decades, this day has come to be remembered as Holocaust Memorial Day. In honor of this, I want to tell the story that Simon Wiesenthal told me, who I was deeply, deeply privileged to meet during my State of the World Forum days back in the late 1990s. Simon Wiesenthal, you may know, was the great Nazi hunter. He helped bring in Adolf Eichmann. He helped track Joseph Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz. Many of you know Adolf Eichmann was really presided over the operations. He was the chief operating officer of the Holocaust and escaped after hiding in Austria for 5 years after the war. He escaped in 1950 to South America. And Simon Wiesenthal, who had endured from 1941 as a Austrian Jew till May of 1945. He was in one concentration camp after another. He was on several death marches where they literally marched people to death. And after the war, he dedicated his life's energy to bringing these people who had perpetrated that crime to justice. He tells a story that's recorded in his master book, The Sunflower, that in 1943, he was at one of the camps that he'd been assigned to, and he was in labor gang, and he was seconded one day to work to get rid of medical trash at a German medical facility for soldiers. As he was walking up the road, guarded by the SS troops to the camp, they passed a cemetery for German soldiers. And on top of each of the graves was a sunflower. And he thought, I wonder if I died, whether I'd at least get a sunflower. He was brought into the camp, and a nurse orderly said to him, I need to take you to one of the rooms. And Wiesenthal thought he was going to be taken away and shot. And what he found instead was a mortally wounded young German soldier named Karl Seidel, 21 years old, dying. And he requested that the nurse find a Jew. And as fates decreed it, it was Simon Wiesenthal. And the young man said, I just need to talk to a Jew because I committed unspeakable crimes. And I want you to forgive me. I was part of the Hitler Youth. I joined the SS. I believed in the Third Reich. And then we began to engage in atrocities of unspeakable horror. And the one atrocity that he had to tell Wiesenthal was an event a year previous where they'd come upon a village and they rounded up all the Jews, some 300 men, women, and children, pressed them into a building, set it on fire. And some of the Jews went up to the upper stairs and when it was being engulfed in flame because they chained the doors, locked the doors, they began to jump out of the windows. And Karl Seidel and the other troops shot them down before they hit the ground. Some of them were babies. And he said, I need you to forgive me for what I've done. Simon Wiesenthal was speechless and didn't say a word. And he left. Came back the next day, and the nurse orderly told him that Karl Seidel had died during the night, having at least had the opportunity to ask for forgiveness, and that he wanted his clothes and his belongings to go to Simon Wiesenthal. Wiesenthal refused. He said that they should go to Karl's mother. But that experience was like an irritant in the oyster in Simon Wiesenthal's mind. And he began, even as he was still in the concentration camp, to ponder, can I forgive these people for what they've done? And he never could answer the question, but he wrote the book laying out what had happened and inviting originally 10 when the book was first brought out, but eventually 53 people, including the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu and Marcuse, the great French philosopher, and various other Jewish intellectuals of the day, Christian theologians, ethicists, doctors. Would you have forgiven Karl Seidel for what he did? And the book is well worth reading. One of the most powerful books I've ever read. Because there's no easy answer to a question like this. It's easy to forgive if you've been slighted. or you've been hit on the playground. But against the enormity of the Holocaust, as St. Paul says in the book of Romans, there is such a thing as an unforgivable sin. The sin against the spirit, he says. So as we open this week of forgiveness in a time of duress, let us remember two things. One, the question we are going to ponder has been pondered by people far greater than ourselves in the face of horrors far deeper. Number two, the answer that each of us brings to this question, even if it's tentative, says as much about who we are in our moral development than it says about the actual question that is being answered. It's a Rorschach test. It reveals who we are. It doesn't make us what we are. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising. What an unbelievably exciting and deep and layered and textured question to ponder at this time. So it's my pleasure now to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington. And Tom, I turn the program over to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And thank you, as always, for your very thoughtful and wise opening comments. As I shared last Monday, the genesis of this week and last week's program on strategic resistance came after the result of the outcome of the U.S. election. And at the time, I was in not a particularly healthy place, and I felt it was important to do 2 weeks. The first week on strategic resistance, and this week on forgiveness, based on the work of Barbara Deming and her 2 hands of nonviolence. The perspective that she spoke and wrote about at the time was, I will not accept your actions, but I will love you as a human being. And so I felt it was important that we bookend the 2 weeks with that perspective. And what I'm realizing is that, conceptually that was a good idea to put the 2 weeks together. But what I hadn't anticipated was my reaction, and the reaction of many of the people who we talked about last week, who are the targeted population that are, being endangered by the actions of President Trump. And what I hadn't expected was that the conversations this week are probably too soon for many people. They are for me. I've been in contact with some of the targeted populations who are outraged with the executive orders, the actions that are being taken. They're scared, they're afraid, they're concerned for their lives. And even the possibility of forgiveness is too raw and it's too soon. And I had not anticipated, while I'm not surprised by the actions that President Trump has taken, I hadn't anticipated how the timing of this week on forgiveness would be too soon for many folks. And I deeply appreciate that and understand it, as I'm feeling that way myself. Part of what has been there for me is, as we've witnessed over last week, how President Trump is absolutely consumed by power. He's talked about he wants to be seen as the president of peace and prosperity, and that's what he's bringing to the world. And unfortunately, what we're witnessing is his definition of peace is the absence of war. And his definition of prosperity is prosperity for the very rich. And I think the challenge we all have right now is, how do we work to redeem the soul of America? And we know that forgiveness is an essential piece of how we redeem the soul of our country. As Bill McKibben wrote over the weekend, we are witnessing a time when cruelty is not obscured but exalted. And the actions that the president has taken last week can't be described as anything other than cruelty. When he was first elected back in 2016, I found myself being able to go to a place of compassion for him, not fully understanding or realizing what kind of childhood he must have had that resulted in him becoming the human being and the adult that he has exhibited. But I'm struggling now in this second term of his presidency to find that compassion, to be able to forgive the actions that he's taking. And what is particularly troubling for me is that we have a population here in the US who are consumed by grievances, both real and imagined. And I'm having a hard time forgiving the 90 million Americans who chose not to vote. Some of them, their excuse was, or the reasoning, their logic was that they couldn't overcome the genocide happening in the Gaza Strip, and they couldn't forgive. They couldn't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris. Or the price of eggs was worth the price of our democracy. And I'm having a hard time forgiving those 90 million Americans who chose not to vote. And I'm having a hard time forgiving the 77 million Americans who voted for President Trump because they wanted the Republican Party, and all that it represented. They were prepared to put that ahead of our democracy. So I bring those personal feelings to this week on forgiveness, and I'm looking for my own self-healing. And I invite all of us throughout this week of conversation to what I hope is an opportunity to find forgiveness, an opportunity to heal. I know that to not forgive is to continue to self-administer poison. And I get that conceptually, but I'm having a very hard time personally accepting and being able to forgive the president and the people he surrounded himself by or with, and to forgive the voters who have made this possible. So with those opening comments, I want to invite my very good friend, Eileen Barker, into the conversation. Eileen, it's been you're a fantastic thought partner, and it's been delightful to help organize and kick off this week on forgiveness. So welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Boy, we really have our work cut out for us this week. And I really appreciate your comments and Jim's just really powerful, framing of what we're doing here. I'm trying to just change my view there on my screen so I can see everything. Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts and a lot to say, and I'm excited I think I will just say this because I want to introduce our guest, Fred Luskin, because he can't be with us for very long today, but we're lucky to have him here. And that is that we are in the right, we're always in the right, exactly where we need to be. I know that, and I know you know that. And so this conversation is not too soon, but it may feel like, oh, wait, I'm not ready to forgive. And that's okay because, timing is really important. I think I learned that from Fred. There's no, it's a choice and you do it when you're ready. And, so that's okay. But having this conversation and putting this in the um, public discourse, if you will, I think is really timely because that we're on a path that's kind of spiraling down. So if we can have this little intervention here and say, hey, let's like create a different story. There's a lot we can do to shift this narrative and how we feel about it and our own well-being. So I'm so excited to unfold this week and starting with Fred Luskin. I just can never say enough about Fred. Fred is, is sort of my first forgiveness teacher, and I want to show you his book, Forgive for Good, which I consider the seminal book, although not to take anything away from The Sunflower, but this is really where I learned how to forgive, and it became the basis for what I teach others. So I'm constantly recommending that to people who really want to get a basic grounding in forgiveness and understand it. So Fred, can you join us? Are you there? There you go.
Hello, Eileen.
Hi there. Welcome.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. So Fred,
And thank you for saying those nice things about my book.
well, yeah, it's all true.
Thank you.
I hope you get lots of royalties.
Man.
Yeah, you heard Jim and Tom and kind of laying these really big questions at our feet here today. So, would you like to begin that conversation? Or-
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that came to my mind. One, it is too early to resolve towards forgiveness for many reasons. One, if you're just looking at what is Donald Trump doing, he's only had a week in office. So the data is not there yet as to who he's harmed or what the results are. You've just heard his pronouncements. And then probably your nervous system kicked into high gear and activated. And from my point of view, that needs to be calmed down before we can have any real discussion out what needs to be forgiven or not. Forgiveness is a response to an experience, and part of it is unraveling our own contribution to that response. Secondly, again, it is too early. Um, but I might also look at as someone who has been in situations where there have been like sides and horrors and if you're talking about voting and why a certain number of people didn't show up and a certain number of people didn't vote the way you wanted, it would probably be a good idea to look at whatever side you identified with and examine their and your failures so you could forgive those and move on with a little more clarity. Like, you can't just blame the other side, so to speak, for like coming up with something and that not everybody understanding the goodness of your side. But you really need to examine, let's just say whether you made your case well, whether you followed ethical procedures, whether there were legitimate reasons to not support what you said. I mean, it's to me, as a person who has waded into conflict, it's so much deeper and more challenging than what I'm going to say, Tom, was the normal human confusion and suffering that you have because you see a dark cloud coming that probably is true, and you're already adrenalized trying to fight it, but that is stopping you from having a little wider perspective right now, which is it's too early. And I'm sure at some level we contributed to it in some ways, and we need to work on that piece of it as well. Okay, so there's my initial pontificating, yeah, as how deeply challenging is it. The second thing is, having taught the book The Sunflower, um, I loved hearing that personal introduction to it. I knew so little about the complexity of it. And, one of my regrets teaching The Sunflower at Stanford a couple times, I never got a chance to meet Simon Wiesenthal. And boy, I would have loved that. And the book was so well done and compassionate, and the range of responses was phenomenal, and it led to some amazing discussions and inside of me a wish that I knew more. So Jim's introduction for me was like, yeah, thank you. So there's my two first comments.
Okay, thanks, Fred. It also, we're on Auschwitz Remembrance Day or anniversary. So I'm thinking of another great book that came out of that experience, which was Viktor Frankl's, which I have to say has been really strong with me since the election. I just reread it, and the Man's Search for Meaning is the name of the book. And he too was at Auschwitz and many other camps. And he was a psychiatrist from, interesting, Austria also. I wonder if they knew each other. But Viktor Frankl to me is holding out such a template, because what he talks about is hope. Hope in the face of the greatest darkness. And I would say the Holocaust is one of the greatest darknesses we know of as humans. And in the face of that, he talked about hope in a couple of different ways. One is that he and others immediately observed that when people lost hope in Auschwitz, they died very quickly. He said having hope didn't guarantee you lived, but losing hope pretty much guaranteed you did not. And that was one thing. And then the other thing that I think he's really famous for saying, many people have heard this, is that in any situation, our last remaining freedom is the freedom to choose our attitude. And that there is a moment between a stimulus and a response, and in that gap is our power to choose how are we going to think about this? How are we going to regard this? And to me, that has a lot to do with forgiveness. And it's not too soon for that. It may be too soon to say, oh yeah, I forgive X or Y, but to choose, that's the moment I think we're in. How do we want to relate to this, whatever's happening? I agree with you, Fred. A lot of it is unknown. And a lot of it is, as I think we're projecting what we think, kind of worse, catastrophizing. And maybe we're right.
Eileen,
What?
all over the place, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, projecting blame outward, um, and probably it is showing each of us a lot of the unresolved stuff inside of us that has a trigger now to examine it.
Exactly. I love Jim saying this is like a Rorschach. It is. It's really amazing. It's a Rorschach that we get to see ourselves in a way if we're willing to go there and look at it. Really powerful. And in that way, I know it's too soon to say things like that, but that's the gift of it. There's always the silver lining. Well, that could be one right there. it's giving us a huge mirror of
Well,
our.
so two of the things that we've taught over the years, one is it's essential to grieve before you forgive. And grieving is not um, easy because it's filled with confusion and different kinds of pain, and you go through a whole gamut of responses that are required. But you can't rush grief. Like it pulls at us, and it forces it forces our nervous system literally to rebalance itself. And so the anger and the fear and the hurt and the disruption, those are all necessary components before you can forgive, because you got to process stuff, and you got to recognize your lost dreams and the things that have been taken and change and all this other stuff. And forgiveness doesn't short circuit that. Um, one of the things, Eileen, also that I remember from from Viktor Frankl's book, was a very challenging thing at the beginning of the book where he said, often the best among us did not survive. That the most sensitive, the most gentle, a good number of them just threw themselves into the electrified fences
Yeah.
because they could not tolerate the horror. And that's one of the challenging things about this, that not all human beings can deal with a certain level of horror and loss and just, real catastrophe. The second piece is when you mentioned Viktor Frankl's strong assertion about choice. That is part of the heart of this, as you said. Like, we have to ask ourselves how much of our reactions become owned by other people. And do we want to give away our power and our freedom to respond just because other people have behaved badly? And the second thing you want to ask yourself is, in a world filled with suffering and horror, is this the thing that I am committed to giving up my power to and my freedom? Because there's so many choices. There's no end to horrible things going on. So there is that choice thing, that how much sovereignty do I want to maintain about my own mind and heart, and how quickly do I want to give that up because people behave badly? That's like an a priori question.
Yeah. That's it. That's what's sitting in me, exactly just what you just said. And again, like reading Frankel's book at that time, it really, for me, it helped shifted it, because for me, as awful as things, seem like they are or might be, and are, for instance, in Gaza and other places, I still could say, well, is it worse than the Holocaust? No, it's not worse than that. So I just feel that it's what he said and the context with which he spoke that helped me say, oh, wait a minute, is what's happening in this country, like trans rights and immigrant, is it worse than? No, it's not. So I feel like, okay, these words still have meaning for me a lot. And something else he said that I wrote down because it's so powerful. He said, if even one person can do this, it's sufficient for him. It's sufficient proof that man's inner strength may rise above his outward fate. If even one person does it, and that reminds me of something you wrote, Fred, in your book about is something unforgivable. And you said, well, if there's even one person who forgave, then you can't say it's unforgivable. And that was really powerful for me because that's true. I've met, and I think you did too, but with people who have, Eva Court comes to mind. She was a victim of Dr. Joseph Mengele, and she forgave him. She chose to, she was a child when she was experimented upon in Auschwitz, and with her twin sister, a horrible, horrible experience. She decided to forgive and was such a powerful example of just taking her power back. That's why she did it. She didn't want to live her whole life as a victim. She did it to take her power back. So I think it's all about that choice that we have and the sovereignty that we have. But you're also right in saying that you can't bypass at all. The emotions are the path. To me, they're the path. That's what is, you have to feel it. You have to feel it to heal it, as they say. But whether it's sorrow, fear, grief, ultimately, and I think because it is such a deep and difficult one, we do a lot to avoid feeling it. A lot of us do. I know I have. But then when I allow myself to feel it, it's so liberating. It's just such a liberating emotion because it just takes you all the way through to a very deep and beautiful place of how much you care, how much you love. And so words can't even do it justice, but that we have to go through, we have to start where we are. So there's no bypass at all. But it's one thing to feel what we're feeling. We can do that. And at the same time, take choice over what we're saying about it, what meaning we're making about the story. What story are we telling about? And it always comes back, and this is part of Fred's book, the grievance story. Who are we blaming? We have to look at that. Are we blaming? Are we telling ourselves that we're powerless? Which I think is what leads to so much fear because we feel powerless. When the government says, basically, you don't exist, basically, if they say you don't exist, you have no, that you feel very powerless, and you have to remember, wait, I do exist. Just because somebody put that on a piece of paper, I still exist. And it's not easy, but that choice is very, very essential to.
Eileen, one of the really difficult parts of forgiveness that you're getting to is that to some degree we are powerless. And what's so hard is to make peace with that vulnerability. And that's what most of the resistance to forgiveness is about, that we don't want to own that there are experiences we can't stop, we can't end, we can't change, and that connects us to a deep human experience of vulnerability.
Yes.
And sometimes it's that your partner stops loving you. You're growing along, you have a good life, and they go find a better model. And there was nothing you can do, and the anger is a protective shield from looking at that human experience of vulnerability. It's absolutely necessary for a while. But then we have to, not have to, we have to go inside, recognize the vulnerability, and then use some of that space to choose what we do about it, what we do about the vulnerability. And some of the stuff that we would teach around forgiveness was to make sure you don't get consumed with what's wrong. So you still pay pretty rapt attention to what's good and beautiful in the world, so you don't get such a distorted perception. That there is a lot of horror always, and there's a lot of beauty always. And if we're not careful, we over-focus on what's wrong and under-focus on what's right. That's one practice. But the other practice is that we want to look at also what we can forgive. So maybe it's legitimate that some of us can't forgive Donald Trump or can't forgive Joe Biden for hanging on too long and creating all sorts of problems that in part led to Donald Trump. And I don't know which piece of which, but we can forgive ourselves, or maybe we can forgive our best friend for not doing something, or maybe we can forgive in our world so that we take regular practice at keeping our heart open. And I think that's the parallel process of do things that keep your heart open so you don't get a world of you clouded by whatever it is that you can't open your heart to. And then the conversations change. I'll finish this piece with, for me, the most important forgiveness teaching I ever got was when Ram Dass said, back looking at the 60s, I've never seen so many angry people marching for peace. And that changed my entire perspective literally on everything. If you want peace, you have to be peaceful. If you want forgiveness in the world, you have to forgive. If you want kindness, you have to do it. And that's a deeper challenge than most of the discussions hinge on. That what are we doing? And what are our values in the world? And again, we would have people when we started teaching forgiveness, because forgiveness scares everybody. It just scares everybody. And people would try to poke holes in what we were saying by saying, well, would you forgive Adolf Hitler? And, I don't know how you answer that, but some of what we'd say was, well, don't worry about Adolf Hitler, forgive everyone else and make that your contribution to peace in this world. And these are very, very deep and difficult questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fred, I'd like to explore a bit about some of the things you shared in your remarks. There's a number of comments about evil in the world, as a force that exists. You spoke about people in your lives, personal relationships, and how to heal the discord that exists between individuals on a personal level, in addition to self-forgiveness and healing oneself. And I'm wondering if you could speak to both of those.
About the existence of evil?
Yeah.
Seems pretty hard to make a case that there isn't. I mean, nobody gave me first bite into insight about that or how this universe was created, but boy, there does appear to be a dark force, and some people hook on to that dark force, and they defend their dark energies in the way that some people who are really wonderful and holy defend theirs. And that makes living on planet Earth difficult for every human being because I remember working in schools. I was a school psychologist for a number of years, and there was an estimate. Now, you'd get like kids in first grade who didn't behave or were disruptive in class. And it turned out that somewhere around 90% of those kids would turn it around. But about 10% wouldn't, no matter what you did, no matter what help they got, no matter even what kind of parents they had, they just ended up not being pro-social in some way. And even at that level, it brought up that question, like, there are a percentage of human beings who seem to get energy from disruption, from creating hurt, from an exaggerated selfishness. I don't know what you would call it, but evil's a good enough stand-in for that. But that's not the majority of injustice. The majority injustice is simply normal selfishness and normal indifference to how our actions impact others. That's what most of it is, but my answer to you is yes, I believe a percentage of it is darker and deeper than that. I forgot if there was a second piece.
Yeah, the second piece was around repairing relationship with personal relationships, family members, friends, and you started to speak to that. And I'm wondering if we could explore that a bit more.
I think what I was trying to say, Tom, is one of the other challenges for all of us, and you bravely stood, said your own challenge. So I used you as an example, but I don't know you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We all have a full life, and that life is complex and filled with both suffering and beauty. So our best self is recognizing that there are maybe undiscovered beauty that we can bring out to help balance some of the horror that we see, which is true. That was one piece. The second is part of the hurts and losses and grievance that we have is not just political and social, but is individual. And sometimes, since we can't influence the political and social so much, we can make our small world healthier and more loving by forgiving as much as we can within it. Does that help explain that?
Yeah, thank you for that. And a piece I would add to that, and you both were talking about it earlier, last week's program on Thursday and Friday, both of our panelists talked about joy, and that they were embracing joy and taking agency and control of their life and how they saw the world, and weren't going to give up their power, personal power, and were choosing joy. And that was an unexpected part of the conversation last week. And I so appreciated the perspective that they brought to our program last week around strategic resistance. That's one of the ways we can resist is how we see the world, or how we choose to see the world.
The only caution around that is, and why this is so difficult, is like you don't want to use what might be referred to as spiritual bypass to get to joy, which is that I'm just not going to look over there, or I'm simply going to focus on the fact that I'm affluent and my life is fine. The deepest challenge is to find things that are wrong that you want to heal without getting lost in that so it obscures joy. But those are different tendencies. And those are really challenging because, we have a kind of responsibility also to try to make this world a better place.
Yeah, I think what particularly for our panelist on Thursday, Jody Evans, when she brought joy into the conversation, what made it so powerful was she's in LA and she's watching all of what's all of her community being burned down, and the response to the fires, and people coming together and being in community and supporting each other, all all while we have what's happening here in Washington, D.C. going on at the same time. And she was able to choose joy. And so, I absolutely agree and hear you about spiritual bypass. But she was, holding a lived experience of joy. And it was beautiful to be reminded of that.
But the one other thing that I will say, having, worked with so many people with so much suffering, I mean, this is not an easy planet. I mean, for whatever we chose to get born here or whatever, we chose a tough one. But there's also that forgiving oneself in this, that we can't make it all right. And that the world is going to continue with injustice and with all sorts of its same old, same old. And that's hard. I do mindfulness and some forgiveness training for some of the Stanford sports teams that I teach people, like if you miss a free throw, forgive yourself, basically. And the basketball team last year made a sweatshirt of I did my best and I forgive the rest. That but that's got to be in this too. And I think not having that makes our opposition less potent, because then we're brittle and harsh rather than just, hey, we're here at this time. This is an issue that we need to address. We're going to do what we can, but it's ultimately not just up to us. We can only do what we can. And that helps reduce some of the frustration and some of the hostility that we project out. But you don't want to stop trying to make the world a better place. Like, that's an essential ingredient of, to me, full humanity. So I did that's cheesy, but that's what they put on a t-shirt. I did my best and I forgive the rest, but that needs to be in there.
Yeah, I think it's great. That's good.
They
Yeah.
even made cups with that. Like it was a team motto for last year.
Words to live by, truly. That's all we can do. And I really appreciate that contextualization of where we are, Earth. Not an easy, that is really important to remember. This
It
isn't a
is.
place where everything gets, happy end. I mean, there are happy endings sometimes, but and we're all, I've really not met anybody that doesn't have their portion of struggle and suffering and challenge, and some of it's pretty horrendous and more. I mean, that's not the exception to the rule. You talk to
And
people. Yeah,
Eileen, let me finish my time here because
that's
um, I do have to go. But as my social scientist piece, what I want to finish with is blame is a destabilizing physical thing. That the more people have blame, the more health issues they have.
mm,
That it's a position of powerlessness and projection, both of which are not good for health. Like if you're responsible for my happiness, I'm in trouble. In particularly if I pick the really bad people on the planet to make responsible for my happiness, I'm in even more trouble. So blame is good as an indicator of where something is wrong, but it's not a great quality for solving it. You know, it's like there's a problem here, yes, because blame leads to health issues. It just does, because it's a tight, destabilizing nervous system, dysregulating quality. And the second is anger is designed to make us unable to think straight. Like it's really designed for that. So you make stupid, quick decisions to protect yourself. But it is never good for long-term reflection as to what's best to handle situations. But again, it's a pointer, problem, problem, problem. You better deal with this problem. But over a longer period of time, it serves to make it impossible to solve the problem.
That's great.
Because anger is, you know, literally your brain frying. And then it takes your nervous system and your cardiovascular system with it. So there's nothing wrong with anger. It's like necessary. But if it becomes a default for how you look at something, you're going to make stupid decisions because that's its purpose. And so these are just two things to be careful of, blame and anger, because they're necessary short term and not the optimal way to deal with anything long term. And that was where we used to really focus in our forgiveness teaching, that as the Buddhists say, you want to create more skillful responses. And, you know, from my point of view, forgiveness is one of those more skillful responses. But you can forgive somebody and still think they did wrong. You know, you don't give up your thinking and discernment. But it's deeper and more nuanced. Anyway, Eileen, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's lovely.
There's so much, there's a lot of appreciation for you happening in the chat. So, and for me, and I'm sure Tom, and so thank you for being with us as always.
Oh, I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk to nice people about forgiveness. The world needs so much of it. It's like we are drowning in grievance.
Truly.
And it is so nice that this group has organized this to speak about forgiveness. It's wonderful. Eileen, we'll meet again in Mill Valley.
Okay.
And Tom, nice to see you.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you again for being with us.
Of course, and maybe one day you and I can meet in person. Take
Sounds
care.
good. Bye-bye. Wow. How are you feeling about that, Tom?
You know, Fred, his mannerism, the way he holds himself, the way he conducts his voice, it's very soothing. It's very helpful.
Cool. You're our canary in the coal mine, I think. You know, it is. There's just something as I've said before, he was sort of, you know, one of the reasons I got into forgiveness, meeting him and reading his book. And I just always love hearing him talk about it because it's just his clarity, and he's very down to earth, and he's got a big perspective. So yeah, I really appreciated hearing that today. And like he said, you know, it is too soon on some levels, but there are things we can do. So we do what we can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really appreciated him bringing in the necessity for grieving,
Mm-hmm.
and also bringing in the role of anger and the role of blame. And you know, that's is a very important understanding of the context of forgiveness. And the final piece of you can forgive but not accept the actions of another.
we talk a lot about in forgiveness, a lot about there's like as Fred said, there's forgiveness is a sort of a skill set, and you can break it down into component parts, which is what we do in my work. Some of them that I learned from Fred, and some others that I brought in. And what we talk about is that after you acquire those abilities, like looking at blame is one of them, for example, um, it's a toolbox, and you can use that um, sort of as an ongoing life practice. And so, even short of going through a whole forgiveness process, I can say, wait a minute. And I have actually the blame piece, just looking at that in this context. It's very tempting. I've certainly crossed over the line and had to pull myself back, wait, because it's so disempowering. And I think that's one of the things that stands out to me is this is not a time to give up our power. It's a time to get as powerful as we can so we can be as effective as we can in whatever we feel is ours to do, which is another big discernment. Even we could be very upset and angry, but it may not be ours to do, but it might be. So that's going to be something we have to pay attention to, but we want to be powerful.
Mm.
And so um, one of the themes for me of this week, in a way, is how do we stay connected to our core, including our spiritual core? For me, that's where we get our insight, our intuition, our guidance. And if we stay connected to our core, not in denial. I mean, that's the thing also. I'm really grateful to Fred. He teased out so well. No bypass here. So it's really honoring the emotions, the feelings, the stages. You have to go through that, and you want to, because there's so much, it's so rich. So much information in there. That's where so much growth happens.
Mm.
And unfoldment, it's not in the words, it's in the feelings. And so going through that path of our feelings is, for me, the gateway to liberating ourselves in some way. But staying connected to that core is one of the things that I want to be talking about this week. And I think especially we'll be diving into that on Wednesday. But I wrote down a few notes. So I think another big theme is going to be addressing the fear, terror, panic, anger, which Fred started to, but I think each of our speakers this week will illuminate that for us. I think that's really important, meeting ourselves where we are. I want to say something about the sacred feminine here
Mm.
that is important because our world is so out of balance in the masculine. And we're seeing that right now. That is a lot of what we're seeing in Washington. I don't see any sacred feminine in there. I don't really see sacred masculine either. I see toxic masculinity, but I want to go to the sacred feminine, the divine wisdom of the sacred feminine, and our wise adult that can access that. We all have access to, we all have the ability to access that, which, is connected to being our spiritual core, gives us access to that. So I think that's an important, I mean, to me, these are antidotes to the news, if you will, or what's happening, which, by the way, I find it very beneficial to just take teeny pieces of that and turn it off mostly. It's toxic, and it's not even like, okay, it's not like here's what's happening. It's here's a catastrophized spin on it. And that piece with Elon Musk is a perfect example. It was shown as the Heil Hitler, and then you watch it, and he was talking about his heart. Well, maybe that was a guise to be, but it's like that spin was put out, And that's just an example of what we see all the time. So it's not helpful. And for me, forgiveness and the path, which doesn't necessarily, it's more than just forgiving Trump. It's accessing these parts of ourselves that aren't blaming, that are connected to our core, that are choosing our sovereignty, as Viktor Frankl talked about. And it's a gateway ultimately to unity consciousness, to connecting to the place where we're beyond this. We have a word in Yiddish that I'm going to use because it's so perfect, mishigas, all this mishigas. And you probably can tell what that means just by me saying it that way. All this crazy soup. But then there's this place where we can transcend that all, where we can have a very different perspective that people may have different ways to referring to it, but I think of it as oneness, unity consciousness. So I think it's an important time to stay connected to that. And focusing on our shared humanity and our hope is really important right now. So those are some of the themes. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, it related to what Fred was saying about being in our power so we can do what we need to do. I take example of that from two of my role models. One was Gandhi, who, I mean, he fought injustice as deeply as any injustice we're seeing now, and he did it with an open heart. He refused to ever demonize any opponent. He didn't see them as enemies. He befriended them. He extended love, but he fought diligently, and he was clever. He figured out good leverage points that I think we're still searching. Well, what are those? What are those now? Let's look for those. And so he's a really excellent role model, and I'm sure he was mentioned last week in the discussion of nonviolence. I think I on Monday heard Michael talking about that and the spinning wheel. And Nelson Mandela, who also just suffered mightily at the hands of the apartheid government. But he too had a deep, deep commitment to his heart. And he was not going to let that close down no matter what, and came out of prison after 27 years of harsh conditions, befriending the warden, honoring the warden at his inauguration, and came out with them. So these are, just really, they've walked it. They've shown us a way that there is another way. And as Viktor Frankl said, if even one person can do it, it shows us that it's possible. And I think that this is a time where many people have said it's not anymore about having one Gandhi or one Mandela or one Buddha. It's about all of us accessing our inner Buddha, our inner Kuan Yin, our inner Christ, our inner, all of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those and bringing those points into the conversation. I was reminded, and I brought this up in last week's broadcast, that on Monday, Dr. Bernice King spoke at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in a very, very powerful way that I would put and hold as the divine feminine speaking. And we certainly saw the bishop at the National Cathedral requesting President Trump for mercy. And in my reading of his reaction and Vice President Vance's reaction was their hearts were closed, completely closed, and they both appeared to be operating from a place of toxic masculinity. The other piece you brought up was, in the work of Terence Real, who I've referenced before. He talks about each of us, we have in us our wounded child, our adaptive child, and our wise adult. And so much of the rhetoric we've seen coming from Elon Musk, from President Trump, from J.D. Vance, and so many others is what appears to be 8-year-old boys. The language, the word choice they're using, the behaviors, the actions are like 8-year-old boys. They're adaptive children running around, holding the levers of power. And my invitation to them is to step into their wise adult. And I was watching yesterday, the U.S. government sending hundreds of migrants back to Colombia, and the president of Colombia stepping up as a wise adult, saying, no, we will not allow the dehumanization of our citizens. If you want to return them to our country, we will welcome them on passenger planes, but not as cargo in Air Force cargo ships or cargo planes. And I'm seeing reports already that President Trump is stepping down from his position with Colombia. And I'm hoping that we will see more world leaders step up in their wise adults in response to these adaptive child behaviors or childlike behaviors that we're witnessing so far.
Yeah, that's very good. I appreciate you referencing that. It does put perspective on it. It's like little 8-year-old boys who've been given like unfettered power and wealth. And so yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's just sort of shows how unbalanced our whole our whole country is that we would choose that on some level. But there's that's sort of a mirror of who we are on some level. And I know that 76 million Americans chose that, but 74 million didn't, and 90 million didn't vote. So it's not like that's all of who we are. And we have to remember that too, that there's just as many or more people who aren't really down with that at all. And again, although it seems like they have all this power, on some level they do, and on some level they don't. And we don't need to feed it.
Right.
We just don't need to feed it by hanging on every word and letting it take something from us. Like we just need to really stay our real power. This is how I think of it. We have no control over what happens outside of us. Other people, we have no control over that. But we have total control over what happens inside of us. That's where our work is. That's where I put my attention and train other people to put their attention, because it takes a lot of skill and commitment to not give your attention away, and to own your attention and decide where you're going to put it. And I really find that the most valuable place to put it is within myself, and do my work to clean up what I need to clean up and feel and know. And then doorways open through that of insights, synchronicity, flow. And I'm sure many people who are listening know exactly what I'm talking about. Being in the flow, knowing that I am right where I need to be, and at all times, and I know what I need to do and say. And that is just the way I'm choosing to live. And I can just report it works really well. And and it's hard work. It's hard work because there's so many things pulling at us, and it's really hard when, and I have this, and I know, Tom, you do too, people very, very close to me, in my family, have two things that are going on. One, people who see this very differently, vote differently, etc. And people who are hurt by some of what's happening and are scared by some of what's happening. and wondering if they need to leave the country because of things that are happening. It's funny. Some people feel they need to leave. Some people are being forced to leave. But it's hard to sit in that. And yet that's what we have to do. And so I just feel that we're in a time of, I think we could call it chaos in a way. And how do you locate yourself? How do you stay grounded and centered and present and not just feel thrown around by it? That's really part of the challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen a number of pundits writing that President Trump he's very effective at breaking things
Yeah.
and not building things. So we are in a place of chaos. And so, picking up on your point, Jim's comment earlier, we're looking in the mirror of our society, or this is a Rorschach test for us. And so I'd like to invite Jim back for closing comments as we close out this first day on our week on forgiveness.
Can I just say one more thing about that?
Absolutely.
I love what you just said, but in the face of these 8-year-old boys breaking everything, there's an opportunity. And that's what I hope we can really look at in time is, okay, so, and maybe not in these 4 years, but maybe the next 4 years
Mhm.
to rebuild and see that some of that breaking was good. I would agree that some of this needs to be broken up, in the government, and it hasn't worked well for a long time. Do I like the way? No, but so I think the opportunity, though, is to look forward and how could we really take it in a direction that would hold these values that we're talking about.
Mm.
Thank you.
Jim, your device is on mute.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Tom. Eileen, I'd like to go back to the question that I opened our program with and ask you whether in your world and as you perceive forgiveness, are there acts which are unforgivable? Or are you someone who believes that in the end, everything is forgivable? And I think given the fact this is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, let's just use the Holocaust and the Simon Wiesenthal story um, as the context here. How would you have answered his question as to whether what Karl Seidel and the Germans did, would you have forgiven him or not?
I don't know what I would have done, to be honest. I've read that book, and it's one of those books where, there's 50 different perspectives, and I sort of agree with all of them. And I did notice when I read it that the Jewish commentators all said no, and the Christian ones all said yes. I thought that was interesting. All might be too strong a word, but there was definitely that theme. I would say I don't know what I would have done, but I would say it's not unforgivable. Objectively, it's not unforgivable. And I take that, I don't take this lightly. I feel this as I'm saying it, but I take that from Fred's book and his observation that you can't objectively say something's unforgivable if people have forgiven. And I know people who have forgiven what happened to them in Auschwitz. And I also just feel that it's up to the person who suffered it to just it's their move. And I know that the one woman I'm thinking of, Eva Kor, I mentioned her early in the call, she chose to forgive Mengele and the others, the Nazis. And she was really criticized by the Jewish community for doing that. And her response was, look, I forgave for myself. It's my choice. I have that power. I have that right. I'm not forgiving for anybody else. And I felt that was very important, that just because one person chooses doesn't mean it's very personal. So, I think it would be very, very difficult to hear what he had done and forgive him. I think it would be really, really hard, but I can't say it's unforgivable. And when I wrote about it, when I wrote my forgiveness workbook, I wrote about that book, and I feel like the deepest question there is, could he forgive himself? Could he forgive himself? And I do, in some way now, all these years later, realize, I mean, I do sort of credit him for even wanting forgiveness, even recognizing that what he had done was so horrible, because I think there's a lot of Nazi, whatever, officers and soldiers who didn't, who really, and also I do have come to understand that it is true that a lot of the army officers were also, had a gun pointed to their head, the Hitler Youth and so forth. That wasn't it really a choice. Some of them may have bought into it, but they really did not have a choice. So that was really forced on them too. So deep question. I don't have a straight answer for you.
Tom, where would you come out? Given the same question as I just posed to Eileen, would you have forgiven or not?
Yeah, I'll share a couple of personal experiences I have that will help answer the question. I've studied with a Tibetan Rinpoche for years, and he was brutally beaten and incarcerated by the Chinese government, and was, transferred from a prison to a prison hospital to die. He managed to break out, across the Himalayas, get to Dharamsala, and came to the US and spent 6 months in a hospital, being treated for 5 or 6 life-threatening illnesses. And part of what helped him heal was removing the poison that was inside him, forgiving his captors for brutally beating and nearly killing him. And, being with him, being in his presence, seeing firsthand what it's like to forgive and to have a place of compassion for people that, under other circumstances, he should have died. And he has nothing but compassion and love for them. And he genuinely believes and wants them, when they leave their body in this lifetime, that they not go to some hell realm because of their actions that they chose or were ordered to do. And so, that's an incredibly powerful story. And to witness that, and when he shares the story, to see him break down in tears, not because of the pain that he experienced, but because of the pain that these individuals brought on themselves. I mean, each of us, somewhere inside us, even if it's only one of the 75 trillion cells in our body, is a moral compass where we know the action we're taking is wrong. And so, coming from that perspective, yes, I have to say, it wouldn't be easy, but I would have to find forgiveness. And witnessing the genocide that's been happening in Gaza, and knowing that that's happening because that forgiveness didn't happen, and that the trauma from the Holocaust is, in part contributing to the genocide that's happening there now, I have to say yes.
Tom, when you were just sharing that, this is what it sparked for me. When you talked about how Trump and Musk, I think, no, Trump and Vance, but probably Musk too, like they're disconnected from their heart. And I remember thinking, it was kind of in the back of my mind, well, like wanting to feel compassion for that. That's very painful. And then with what you're sharing with the Rinpoche, like, again, like, could we find compassion, knowing, because we do know that there are always, I mean, whether you want to call it karma or cause and effect, there's always a cause and effect. So none of this is happening in isolation. It may seem right now like it's just whatever, they can do whatever and there's no consequence, but there always is. At some level, whether we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know, that's not ours it's above our pay grade, so to say, but it's inevitable. So just having compassion they're not on a good path. And they are hurting a lot of people, but it's not a good path. So I'm looking for that inside myself. That's what you just sparked. That would be amazing.
Yeah, just to make a few comments of my own, I found your story, Tom, very powerful, and I come back to the point that I made at the beginning about the Rorschach test. And let's take Jesus of Nazareth. If anyone had the reason not to forgive, he had it as he's hanging up being crucified to death, right? And I think one of the reasons why forgiveness is a major virtue in the Christian religion is because the seminal act that created the religion was an act of forgiveness. And I think I would agree with the point that you were making, Eileen and Fred, that objectively, there is no act beyond forgiveness. Subjectively,
Right.
There are many, many acts that are beyond forgiveness, and they measure the moral development of the person who's wrestling with forgiveness. Some people can't forgive, that I was slighted last Tuesday, and I'm still talking about it by some guy on the bus, right? And you can get caught up in, what Carolyn Mace calls the wound. You start to feed off your wound, and that wound becomes a part of your identity. And it takes more effort to heal than to let go of your wound. And you won't let go of your wound because it's become part of your identity.
Yes.
And so I think that that's something that I'm more and more pondering, I think for me also with Gaza, which I find unspeakable. I'll be talking about this tomorrow. And one of the extraordinary ironies that the Polish government is letting a guy, Benjamin Netanyahu, fly to Poland and not be arrested for crimes against humanity and genocide.
Right.
Right. So as we celebrate or commemorate the 80th anniversary, the guy who's going to be given the prime time is a guy who's guilty of genocide. And he's not done.
Right. And so blind to it, completely blind.
Completely blind to it. So I think, the last thing I would say, and then Tom, you should tee us up for tomorrow, unless there's other comments. But the last thing I would say is that sometimes we humans are too quick to provide answers. And that's why I wanted to end with just an acknowledgement, Eileen, of your wisdom, I think, in not being too dogmatically assertive about the Simon Wiesenthal question, because I think it's our capacity to live, on the anvil, the agony of these situations, and realize that in the end, there's our answer, but there's no the answer, that really allows us the space to use these situations for our own moral development, which in the end, as your guru was testifying or bearing witness to, he had ascended to the bodhisattva existentially, subjectively, so he could encompass even his tortures and weep for them. That's a level of consciousness and moral purity that, one rarely has the opportunity to bear witness to. And so anyway, those are a few comments. Eileen, I don't know whether you have a final comment, then Tom, you can tee us up for tomorrow.
Beautiful. No, that's beautiful. Thank you, Jim.
Tom.
Yeah, I'll share a couple of things. So I'll shamelessly put in a plug for Pakyab Rinpoche and his book, Meditation Saved My Life. It's a beautiful writing of his experience of self-healing from his torture. It's a Meditation Saved My Life. It's available. Jim, I really appreciated your reference to Christ. And Rita Marsh put it in the chat as well. I remember watching the election results coming in, and when it was determined that Trump had won the election, that was literally the first thing that entered my mind was, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. I literally just was overtaken by that, knowing what was likely to unfold. And the final comment I would share to your comment as well, Jim, is the mantra I've lived by the last better part of 20 years of my life is we'll see, because we just don't know from moment to moment what's good and what's bad.
Exactly.
And I'm finding my embracing of that mantra right now is challenging. I so want to cling to, I so want to grasp what I think I know to be true. And the reality is, to your comment earlier about the Rorschach test, or Eileen, your comment to the mirror, we're looking at something, and this is forcing us to look at ourselves and look at our nation.
Yeah.
So those would be some of my my thoughts, and I very much welcome being with you this week, Eileen and Jim, as always, for a deep series of conversations on forgiveness. I feel it's incredibly important, especially right now, and I'm looking forward to the amazing group of panelists we have this week to deepen this conversation.
Great, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eileen.
I think I do have one more thing. I have one more thing that it feels important. It's one, I suppose it's sort of a recommendation that off of what you're saying, it's like I feel like our minds are really struggling with everything. And that for me, it's like, let's just drop down into our hearts. And also because what we're seeing is closed hearts. So let's not close ours. And that would be, a really good practice right now, to just breathe. That's what I find myself doing more and more, just breathing into my heart. It's really simple. Like, okay, I don't want to be just all up here. I want to be more heart-centered. Again, I think it is more of the feminine, to be honest. Oh, I don't need the answers. I just need to come into my heart. So that's a piece that I want to put into the mix as we go forward into this week. Keeping our hearts open.
Always good to breathe into your heart. Bottom line, actually.
Right. When in
Not
doubt.
just for forgiveness, for life.
Exactly.
Thank you, Eileen, so much. Thank you, Tom, as always. And that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You can join Eileen and Tom in the after chat. The link has just been put in by Stan. And those of you who received the daily reminders from Zoom, the link is at the bottom of that Zoom reminder. And then we'll see you all again here tomorrow for day 2 of our 5-day program on forgiveness in times of duress. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.